The restaurant was a cocoon of soft light and murmured elegance, its amber glow casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. For nearly 2 decades, Julia Harper had sat across from her husband, Daniel, in places like this quiet, refined sanctuaries where they toasted anniversaries with clinking glasses and whispered promises. Tonight, though, the air felt different, heavy with an unspoken weight that pressed against her chest. She'd chosen the emerald green dress he'd once adored, its fabric hugging her frame like a memory of better days. Her auburn hair fell in loose waves, a deliberate echo of the woman she'd been when they'd first met. But Daniel didn't seem to notice. His eyes, once warm and attentive, drifted to the flickering candle, to the half-empty wine glass he stirred with restless fingers, to the door as if it promised escape. Julia watched him, cataloging the subtle shifts. 18 years of marriage had sharpened her instincts. She could read him like a weathered book. The forced curve of his smile, the way he nodded too quickly at her small toolkit all betrayed him. She tried to anchor the evening with nostalgia, her voice soft as she mentioned their trip to Santorini, the sunburned laughter, their daughter Mia's first clumsy steps on a beach. Daniel chuckled at the right moments, but it was mechanical, a hollow sound that didn't reach his eyes. His gaze flicked to the clock above the bar, then back to the table, where dessert sat melting untouched. "We need to talk," he said finally, his tone flat, clinical like a stranger delivering bad news. Julia's stomach lurched, a cold wave crashing through her. She'd sensed this moment brewing for months, the late nights at the office, the curt texts, the way he'd started sleeping with his back to her. But hearing it aloud still felt like a blade. "Okay," she managed, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Talk." He leaned forward, elbows on the table, his face devoid of the warmth she'd once relied on. "You're not enough anymore. I don't mean to hurt you, Jules. I need more. Something exciting." The words landed like a slap, sharp and humiliating. Julia blinked, stunned, her mind racing to process the absurdity of it. Not enough. After 18 years of standing by him, through his layoffs, his mother's cancer, the sleepless nights when his tech startup teetered on collapse, she was suddenly inadequate? "There's someone else," he continued, his voice dropping to a casual murmur, as if he were discussing the weather. "It's not just about her. It's about me. I feel alive again." The confession shattered her, not because it was unexpected, but because it was so carelessly delivered. She pictured herself screaming, hurling her wine glass across the room, letting the restaurant's polite hush explode into chaos. Instead, she swallowed the rising bile, forced a tight smile and said, "Thank you for being honest." She didn't mean it. She just refused to let him see her crumble. Not here, not now. That night, she left her wine untouched, its sweetness curdling in her throat. She drove home alone, the city lights blurring through unshed tears, and crawled into the bed they'd shared for years. It smelled of him, still cedar cologne and faint sweat. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying his words until they lost meaning. Not exciting. Someone else. Alive. By morning, her grief had hardened into something else. Something raw and unnameable, but not yet strong. Weeks later, routine became her lifeline. She went to work at the advertising firm where she'd climbed to creative director, smiled at colleagues, and pretended the whispers didn't follow her like ghosts. But the cracks showed. In the grocery store, her cart held only essentials: apples, a loaf of bread, a single yogurt because hunger felt distant, optional. That's when she saw them. Daniel, laughing louder than he ever had with her, pushing a cart beside a woman who could have been Mia's college roommate. She was all sharp cheekbones and effortless grace, her blonde hair catching the fluorescent light like a halo. Her hand rested on his arm, casual and possessive, as they debated wine bottles in the aisle. Julia froze, her breath catching. The woman Lila, she'd later learn, glanced her way, offering a polite, clueless smile. Daniel's eyes met hers, and his face twisted into something like panic. He shifted, subtly positioning himself between Lila and Julia, as if shielding his new life from the wreckage of his old one. That small gesture cut deeper than his words ever could. She wasn't just discarded. She was erased. She didn't confront them. She abandoned her cart and walked out, the automatic doors hissing shut behind her. In her car, she gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles whitened, fighting the urge to scream. Instead, she drove to the edge of town, to a quiet park where she and Daniel had once picnicked with Mia. The oak trees stood silent, their branches swaying in the late autumn breeze. She sat on a bench, staring at the pond, and let the first tears fall not for him, but for the woman she'd been before this betrayal swallowed her whole. The divorce unfolded like a slow bleed. Daniel hired a slick young lawyer, a man with gelled hair and a predatory grin, who treated their shared history like a corporate liquidation. He wanted the Hausia mid-century gem Julia had painstakingly restored, the Audi, even the dining table she'd refinished herself. "It's not personal," his lawyer said, sliding a stack of papers across the table. "He just wants a clean break." "Clean for who?" Julia shot back, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. Her own attorney, a soft-spoken woman named Karen, squeezed her hand under the table. They fought back, but Daniel's demands were relentless. He claimed the abstract painting in the hallway, a piece they'd bought together after a rain-soaked weekend in Portland, was a gift from his late mother. Julia laughed, a bitter sound that echoed in the sterile conference room. "We picked it out at a flea market," she told Karen later. "He hated it until Icon V. Wine said him it was art. In the end she let him have it. Not because he deserved it, but because she refused to cling to relics of a life he'd torched. The settlement left her with the apartment she'd rented in Hastie's small, sunlit space with bare walls and unpacked boxes, and a SAVYNGS account halved by legal fees. On her 45th birthday, 3 weeks after the papers were signed, she waited for something, a text, a card, anything from the man who'd once hidden love notes in her coat pockets. Nothing came. The silence was louder than his absence. She spent the day alone, walking through the botanical gardens they cited as a family. The roses were in full bloom, their petals vibrant against the gray November sky. She sat on a bench, tracing the edge of a leaf, and felt the weight of her own invisibility. That night, a neighbor, Mrs. Ortiz, a widow with kind eyes, knocked on her door, holding a slice of chocolate cake from her grandson's party. "Thought you might like some sweetness," she said. Julia took it, thanked her, and shut the door before the tears came. She ate it with her hands, sitting cross-legged on the hardwood floor, surrounded by cardboard boxes. "You're still here," she whispered to herself, the words a fragile lifeline. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Sunday morning, delivered by a woman named Evelyn, her silver hair pulled into a loose bun. She stood on Julia's doorstep, clutching a thick envelope sealed with lavender-scented wax. "You don't know me," she began, her voice raspy but warm, "but I knew your Aunt Clara." Julia frowned, ushering her inside. Clara had been her mother's eccentric sister, a painter who'd lived alone in a cluttered cottage until her death a decade ago. Evelyn explained she'd been a neighbor, tasked with delivering this letter when the time felt right. Julia opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a handwritten note and a pencil sketch of a young girl herself. She realized sitting under a willow tree, lost in a book. Clara's looping script filled the page. "Dear Julia, you've got the same spark I did, buried under life's mess. Don't let it go out. You're not what they take from you, you're what stays. Men chase glitter, but it fades. You're the real thing. Keep painting, kid." Sketches of daisies and sparrows danced in the margins, a whimsical touch that brought Clara's voice roaring back. Julia read it again and again, tears staining the paper. Clara had survived her own heartbreak, a husband who'd left her for a dancer half her age, and turned it into art. The letter was a mirror, reflecting a strength Julia had forgotten she owned. She framed the sketch that night and hung it above her kitchen counter, its presence a quiet rebellion against the emptiness. The next morning, she attacked her apartment with a fury she hadn't felt in months. She tore through boxes, tossing out faded receipts, a tie Daniel had left behind, a pressed rose from their 10th anniversary. Each discard was a small Tory, a shedding of skin. In the last box she found her old sketchbook, its leather cover worn but intact. She hadn't drawn since her 20s, when she dreamed of illustrating fairy tales. The pages were yellowed, filled with half-finished ideas: winged horses, talking trees, a girl with a lantern. She traced the lines, her fingers itching for a pencil. That evening she sketched for the first time in years. Her hand shook, but the strokes came tentative, then bold. A girl emerged on the page wearing red sneakers and a determined frown, staring up at a sky full of swirling clouds. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. She didn't sleep that night, letting the silence fuel her. By dawn, the girl had a name: Lottie, and a story. A child abandoned by a storm, searching for a home in the sky. Work became a battlefield of pity and pretense. Colleagues tiptoed around her, their smiles too bright, their questions too careful. In the break room, she overheard two interns oblivious to her presence, dissecting her life. "He traded her in for a model half his age," one said, popping a chip into her mouth. "I'd die of embarrassment." The other nodded. "She's been a ghost lately." Inequity. Julia stood in the hallway, her coffee mug trembling in her hand. She could have slunk away, let the shame swallow her. Instead, she walked in, sat at their table, and sipped her coffee in silence. The interns flushed, stammering excuses, but she didn't speak. She just ate her sandwich, slow and deliberate, reclaiming the space they tried to steal. Felt good, small but good. Daniel, meanwhile, paraded his new life like a trophy. At a mutual friend's dinner party, he arrived with Lila on his arm, her laughter cutting through the soft jazz. "Everyone, this is Lila," he announced, his voice booming with pride. "We're official now, divorce is finalized." The room stilled, guests exchanging awkward glances. Julia stood by the fireplace, wine glass in hand, and smiled as if she'd heard a mildly amusing story. Someone whispered, "Isn't that his ex over there?" She didn't flinch. Let him perform. Let him think he'd won. But the cracks in his facade were already forming. Lila, with her Instagram-perfect poses and coy smiles, grew restless. Their social media, once a flood of brunches and beach trips, slowed to a trickle. At his tech firm, whispers turned to doubts. Clients noticed his distraction, his arrogance. A major deal collapsed, then another. "He's not the guy he used to be," a coworker muttered over drinks. Daniel didn't see it yet, but the shine was wearing thin. Julia, meanwhile, retreated inward, her sketchbook her sanctuary. Lottie's world grew, a floating city of patchwork balloons, a fox with a crooked grin, a storm that whispered secrets. She didn't tell anyone, not even Mia, who was away at college and tiptoeing around her mother's pain with cautious texts. The drawings were private, fragile, a language she was relearning. One night, a flyer at the community center caught her eye. Illustration workshop. Find your creative voice. Her pulse quickened. She signed up before she could talk herself out of it. The first session was terrifying. She sat among strangers, retirees, young artists, a single mom with paint-stained jeans, her sketchbook clutched like a shield. The instructor, Paul, was a wiry man in his 60s, his hands scarred from decades of ink and canvas. "Draw your truth," he said, his voice gravelly but kind. "Not what you think we want. Just what's real." Julia sketched Lottie again, her red sneakers muddy from a fall. Paul lingered by her table, peering over his glasses. "There's a story here," he said. "Don't bury it." Paul became her guide. He'd illustrated for big publishers, Random House, Penguin, before burnout drove him to teach. "I lost myself," he told her once, over coffee after class. "Took years to dig back out." He saw something in her work, a quiet strength she didn't yet trust. He lent her books on technique, shared stories of his own failures, and invited her to his studio, cluttered loft smelling of turpentine and old wood. "You've got a voice," he said, handing her a cup of chamomile tea. "Find the story only you can tell." She did. Lottie's tale deepened, a girl who'd lost her family to a tempest, building a new one among the clouds. Julia poured her pain into his betrayal, the loneliness, the slow reclamation of herself. One night, Paul tapped her sketchbook. "Submit this," he urged. "There's a small press looking for debut authors. Themes: resilience. Fits you like a glove." She hesitated, but his quiet faith pushed her forward. She polished the story over sleepless nights, each line a piece of her soul. When she hit send, her heart thundered, but she felt lighter. Weeks later, the reply came. "We'd like to meet." At a cozy office downtown, 3 editors pored over her pages. "This is raw," one said, her eyes bright. "But it's got hope woven through it. We want it." Julia signed the contract in a daze, her hands shaking with disbelief. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was creating. The book launch was a blur of nerves and triumph. The venue, a brick-walled bookstore, hummed with chatter. Julia stood at a podium, Lottie's first page glowing on a screen behind her. "This story came from a place I thought was broken," she said, her voice steadying as she spoke. "But it turns out broken things can grow." The crowd, artists, friends, strangers listened, rapt. A teenage girl approached her afterward, clutching the book. "Lottie's like me," she said, eyes wet. "Thank you." Julia's chest ached with something new, purpose. Daniel showed up that night. Unenvited but drawn by the invitation she'd sent, not out of spite, but curiosity. He looked diminished, his suit wrinkled, his confidence frayed. Lila had left him weeks earlier, tired of his neediness, his fading charm. His career was crumbling too, his once loyal team drifting away. He watched Julia shine, surrounded by people who saw her, truly saw her, and the contrast gutted him. "I'm sorry," he said later, his voice small. "I didn't see you." "I know," she replied, calm and final. "But I see me now." Their last meeting came a week later over coffee. He confessed his regrets, his mistakes, his loneliness. She listened, not to forgive, but to close the door. "What you had is gone," she told him, standing to leave. "And I'm not your redemption." Walking away, she felt no anger, only peace. Her book spread translations in French, Korean, Brazil. She spoke at schools, mentored artists, built a life from the ashes. One morning, sketching a new character, an old woman with a lantern, leading others through the dark, she caught her reflection in the window. She smiled, whole at last. The past was a shadow, faint and powerless. The light was hers now, and her story was just beginning.